Dear curious listener, dim the lights, let the fan hum, let the shame settle like dust on a velvet chaise. Tonight, we're peeling back the lace curtain on the most prudish, paranoid, and erotically confused era in history, the Victorian Age. If you're hoping for romantic walks in the rain and stolen glances across the ballroom, you may want to leave. But if you're ready for awkward advice manuals, marital hysteria, and chair legs considered too seductive for polite company, stay exactly where you are. You're stepping into a gaslit room where everything smells faintly of lavender, guilt, and corset sweat. And things are about to get uncomfortably repressed, so get comfortable. And if you like your history just a little bit scandalous, subscribe and tell me what country you're watching from. So, you're walking through the soot-lined streets of Victorian London now. The air is thick with chimney smoke, horse sweat, and an overwhelming sense that everyone is trying very, very hard not to think about sex. Which is funny, because that's all anyone was thinking about. On the surface, the Victorians built a world of rigid manners and moral purity, lace-trimmed respectability, trembling piety, and tea at precisely 4 o'clock. But beneath that corseted calm was a society in full-blown identity crisis, terrified of its own desires, and even more terrified of admitting it. So how did we get here? Well, you can blame Queen Victoria if you'd like, or at least the image of her. The real woman was more complicated, but the symbol she became, chaste, dutiful, pearl-clutching mother of the empire, was weaponized into a national personality. Suddenly, morality wasn't just a virtue, it was branding. The middle class especially clung to it like a safety blanket. You see, this was an era of massive upheaval. Industrial smoke belching from factories, children working in mines, railways shrinking entire countries overnight. Everything felt unstable, except the idea that being proper might protect you from it all. So they built fortresses of decency. Respectability became the national kink, and like any good kink, it came with rules. You may be surprised to learn that Victorians did talk about sex, just not directly. Not in any way that might make you blush. Instead, they dressed it up in euphemism and whispered it into silk pillows. A husband didn't have sex with his wife. He performed his conjugal duty. They didn't sleep together. They engaged in marital congress, or perhaps the silent communion of souls. An orgasm. That would be a paroxysm, ideally one accompanied by prayer and deep remorse. Even body parts were smoothed over like overly polished furniture. Legs were sometimes referred to as limbs. A woman's chest was called the bus line. And don't even think about saying underwear out loud. No, it was called unmentionables, which kind of tells you everything. And so, a cultural performance was born. One where everyone agreed to pretend that desire didn't exist, or at least not in polite company. But of course, men and women weren't expected to play by the same rules. Men, particularly wealthy ones, were quietly allowed to have needs. They might visit a brothel on a foggy Tuesday and then deliver a moralizing sermon on Sunday. No one batted an eye. It was understood. Boys will be sinful. Women, on the other hand, were expected to arrive at the altar spiritually pure, physically intact, and preferably ignorant of how babies actually happened. A good woman didn't desire. She endured. A wife's role was to be modest, passive, and emotionally anesthetized. Ideally, she would lie perfectly still and think of England, if she knew what was happening at all. One particularly grim marriage manual warned that a woman should not feel pleasure, lest her soul become weakened by it. Weakened by an orgasm. you begin to see the problem. And yet, behind closed doors, things were much less buttoned up. The Victorians may have spoken in riddles, but their anxieties were loud. Books, sermons, and medical journals were obsessed with controlling sexuality, especially female sexuality. Because if desire wasn't carefully contained, what might happen? Affairs, moral collapse, the decline of civilization, or worse, someone might enjoy themselves. So, they tried to channel it. Marital sex was allowed, but only under a thick layer of guilt and God-fearing hesitation. A good wife submitted. A good husband controlled himself, and if he couldn't, he visited the doctor, or the brothel, or both. The result was a society that didn't actually suppress sex. It just buried it under a mound of lace and shame. And the effort that took, exhausting. Entire etiquette books were written to guide young women on how to sit, how to breathe, how to speak without sounding too interested. Men were taught to view lust as weakness, unless it happened in secret. Then it was simply understood. So everyone walked around in a state of mild panic, hoping their desires wouldn't show through their tightly laced collars, hoping no one noticed the blush creeping up their neck during church hymns, hoping their dreams didn't betray them. You step into a middle-class Victorian parlor now. It's stiff with overstuffed furniture and tight-lipped portraits. The wallpaper is aggressively floral. The clock ticks judgmentally, and every surface seems to whisper, "Don't even think about touching that. It looks innocent, but it's not." Because this room, like every room in this era, is soaked in silent tension. Desire didn't vanish in the Victorian age. It just put on a very polite mask. And that's the trick of this entire chapter. They weren't actually repressed in the way we think. They were just pretending. And in pretending so hard, they created a paradoxical world, one where sex was everywhere, but no one could admit it, where morals were paraded publicly, but hypocrisy was tucked neatly into the glove compartment of a carriage. The Victorians weren't pure. They were performing purity in high collars, candlelight, and crushed velvet, and they pulled it off until they didn't. You've barely adjusted to the tight collars and moral anxiety of the Victorian age when the doctors arrive. And they are deeply concerned. Not about tuberculosis, not about cholera. No, their real worry is something far more dangerous. Your hands. Specifically, what you're doing with them when no one's looking. Welcome to the golden age of pseudo-scientific panic, where one particularly persistent villain haunted every respectable household: masturbation, or as it was more often called, self-abuse. Because nothing says scientific objectivity quite like shaming people for having fingers. You step into a dim Victorian study now. Mahogany desk, dusty leather chair, a row of ominously serious-looking medical books bound in cracked brown leather. On the shelf, one slim volume stands out. You open it. Inside, diagrams, cautions, Latin, a warning: the solitary vice weakens the spine, dulls the intellect, and leads to moral ruin. Apparently, if you touched yourself too often in 1853, you wouldn't just go blind. You'd also go bald, forget your Latin, and possibly develop a withered limb. Doctors wrote entire treatises insisting that masturbation caused spinal curvature, memory loss, epilepsy, impotence, hysteria, and a charming condition known as nocturnal emissions of a devilish nature. One man reported feeling a burning in the head after touching himself 3 times in 1 week. That man was a physician. The panic wasn't new, but the Victorians industrialized it. In a world obsessed with control, of factories, time, gender, emotion, it made perfect sense that they'd try to regulate the body's last rebellious pleasure. And so they did what Victorians did best. They invented devices. Imagine, if you will, a 12-year-old boy in 1872. He wakes in the night, sweating, confused. Natural, yes? Not to the Victorians. His mother, having read one of the many guides to moral childhood, buys a chastity harness, a metal contraption lined with leather straps, designed to prevent access. Other models came with spikes. Some buzzed when you moved too much. There were gloves sewn shut, pajamas with back buttons, and even cages. Yes, literal cages, for the genitalia. One catalog from 1881 advertised a personal control sheath for young boys troubled by impure dreams. The instructions recommended it be worn at all times except during bathing, and even then with supervision. This wasn't just a boys' club either. For girls, the problem was subtler, more mysterious, and often more terrifying. Because women, you see, weren't supposed to want anything. So when they did, or when they showed signs of nervous agitation, blushing at improper thoughts, or heaven forbid, spontaneous arousal, doctors labeled it hysteria. The cure? Well, that's its own horrifying tale. But sometimes doctors simply recommended the same strategy: restraint, cold baths, and never being left alone with a mirror. Now, the real twist? Some of the most famous names in health and wellness joined the anti-masturbation campaign, including a man whose name you probably heard this morning. Over breakfast, John Harvey Kellogg. That's right, the cornflake guy. Dr. Kellogg was a fervent believer that bland food could reduce sinful urges. He promoted a diet of boiled grains and steamed vegetables. Spices, he warned, inflamed desire. Sugar was seductive. Meat was outright dangerous. So he invented the world's most sexually repressive breakfast cereal, cornflakes, dry, bland, and morally upright. Kellogg also advocated circumcision without anesthesia as a deterrent. He believed pain would create aversion, a theory that tells you everything you need to know about 19th century bedside manner. You sit back, overwhelmed by the sheer creativity of this panic. Spiked rings, seed loss charts, electromagnetic purity belts, food as moral weaponry. It would be funny if it weren't so disturbingly sincere. The medical community, at least the loudest parts of it, fully believed that the body's natural impulses were dangerous. Desire was a sickness, a disease to be fought, like smallpox or socialism. And in doing so, they created a generation of young people who associated their own bodies with guilt, fear, and punishment. But not everyone bought into it. Even in the Victorian age, there were dissenting voices, quieter but present. Some doctors questioned the science. A few reformers argued that all this shame was more damaging than desire itself. And let's be honest, most teenagers ignored everything and figured it out anyway, despite the cages. Still, the message was clear and deeply rooted. Sexual pleasure, especially the solitary kind, was a threat to the moral fabric of society. And if that sounds dramatic, it's because it was. The Victorians weren't just afraid of bodies. They were afraid of losing control of them, and nothing terrified them more than the idea that someone might enjoy themselves without permission. So tonight, as you drift off under the soft whir of your ceiling fan, be grateful. No spiked rings, no sleep cages, no one boiling your oats in the name of chastity. Just you, your own thoughts, and a few echoes from a time when desire had to wear a muzzle. Shall we keep going? You're standing in the corner of a modest Victorian bedroom now. Candlelight flickers. The bed is carved oak, draped in lace, and terrifyingly large. On it sits a woman in a pristine nightgown, clutching a floral handkerchief like a life preserver. It's her wedding night, and she has absolutely no idea what's about to happen. Not metaphorically, literally. She doesn't know, because in the Victorian era, there was no such thing as sex education. Not for girls, not for boys. Instead, there were euphemisms, hushed warnings, a few stern glances at the dinner table. And if you were really lucky, a pamphlet handed to you the night before your wedding titled something like, "What a Young Wife Should Know." Spoiler: she shouldn't know much. You slide into her shoes now. Not literally, of course, that would be improper. But try to imagine it. You've just married a man you probably didn't choose. Your entire education has emphasized duty, silence, and moral virtue. You've been taught to avoid eye contact, suppress your feelings, and never speak of anything below the neckline. And now, you're expected to lie down next to this man and do something. No one told you what, just that it's supposed to happen, and that you should pray. Some Victorian marriage guides went so far as to instruct brides to think of the Lord during intercourse, to close their eyes, to accept the trial of union as a divine burden, and above all, not to enjoy it. Pleasure, you see, was unseemly, especially in women. One especially popular guide warned that a woman who finds delight in her husband's touch may be perilously near spiritual ruin. Another called marital intimacy, the crossing of the soul's desert. Romantic, isn't it? If you're wondering how that worked in practice, it didn't. There are recorded cases of women fainting on their wedding night from sheer confusion. Others screamed, ran from the room, or locked themselves in closets. Some newlywed husbands actually wrote letters to doctors and clergymen asking for advice because their wives were too frightened to be touched. And you can't really blame them. These girls had been raised in a world where ankles were erotic, where table legs had to be covered lest they provoke impure thoughts. And now, suddenly, they were expected to accept a man in their bed. And the men, honestly, they weren't doing much better. The average Victorian groom entered the bedroom with just as many misconceptions. He might have visited a brothel or two. He might have heard things whispered in boarding school halls. But when it came to real intimacy with a wife he was supposed to respect, he was as lost as she was. Marriage guides for men didn't help much either. One advised, do not alarm the wife. Approach with kindness and moderate expectations. Her fear is natural. Her trembling is to be borne with compassion. Not exactly a lesson in romance. Another warned that the first encounter might repel the wife entirely, and that persistence should be gentle, but unwavering. Consent was a vague concept at best. Now let's pause for a moment and appreciate this historical absurdity. Victorian society managed to design a sexual education system so broken that newlyweds often discovered basic facts during intercourse. One young woman wrote in her diary, "I finally understand what Mama meant when she said I'd become a garden." Another described the act as strange, painful, and confusing. But the sheets were not stained, so I must be pure. Some brides were so uninformed they believed pregnancy came from simply sleeping in the same bed. Others thought a kiss could cause conception. One even reported bathing in vinegar after her wedding night because someone told her it might reverse the act. Meanwhile, the only people who did talk openly about sex were prostitutes and physicians, neither of whom were typically invited to dinner. This silence, this orchestrated ignorance, was treated as a virtue. A good woman didn't need to know. A good man didn't need to explain. Instead, they stumbled through the most vulnerable night of their lives with trembling hands, confused expectations, and the ever-present soundtrack of moral panic echoing from the church down the road. And so the honeymoon became less of a celebration and more of a silent negotiation, a ritual of awkwardness, a test neither party was prepared for. Some couples eventually found a rhythm, others never did. Many women suffered in silence for years, believing pleasure was a sin and pain was their burden. And if you're wondering whether this emotional distance had consequences, oh, it did. But that's a tale for another night. For now, you step out of the bedroom, quietly closing the door behind you. The bride stares at the ceiling. The groom is lighting a candle, unsure of what happens next. Neither of them speaks. And honestly, who can blame them? Imagine your sex education coming from someone who thinks chair legs need trousers. You've just been married. Congratulations. You've survived the ceremony, the stiff collars, the boiled mutton, the toasts. You've managed not to faint during the first kiss or trip on your spouse's train. And now, at long last, you're in your bridal chamber. But there's a problem. You're not alone. No, they're not in the room exactly. But they're listening. The maid, the footman, a giddy cousin pretending to fluff the sheets, and on the other side of the door, whispers, ears pressed to keyholes, maybe even a clergyman waiting to confirm that the marriage was properly performed. Welcome to the bizarre world of Victorian consummation culture, where privacy was an illusion and proof of performance was, quite literally, part of the contract. It sounds medieval, doesn't it? That's because it was, and yet traces of these customs lingered well into the Victorian age, especially in rural areas or among aristocratic families still clinging to old traditions with white-knuckled pride. In some places, a couple's first night wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a public obligation. Let's talk about bedding ceremonies. This charming little tradition involved walking the couple, often with candles, singing, and far too many people, all the way to their bedroom. There, friends or family would help them into bed. And by help, we mean strip off their outer garments, offer encouraging advice, possibly throw flowers or rose petals, then leave the room while making very obvious plans to listen through the door. The idea was simple: witness the start of a legitimate union. No one expected a front row seat exactly, but they did expect evidence. Which brings us to one of the more unsettling parts, the bridal sheets. In some households, particularly in more traditional or rural areas, it was common to display the bed sheets the morning after the wedding. Why? To show proof of virginity. A bloodstain, seen as confirmation that the bride had been intact and the marriage had been consummated, would be taken as a sign of purity and success. And if there was no stain, well, there were problems: suspicion, shame, gossip, in some cases, legal battles, in rare but very real cases, annulments. Yes, a marriage could be challenged or even dissolved if it was suspected the couple had not properly, well, sealed the deal. No pressure. Now imagine being a Victorian bride, raised in an era where sex wasn't discussed, where your only education came from cryptic hints and hushed warnings, where your own anatomy was considered indecent to mention. And now, tonight, you're expected to know exactly what to do, to submit with grace, produce physical proof of your virtue, and make no noise that might be interpreted as anything unladylike. Oh, and by the way, the cook will be examining the sheets in the morning. Sleep well. Of course, men had their own performance anxiety. A groom who failed to consummate the marriage, especially if it was a noble match involving land, titles, or money, could be sued by his wife, by her family, by the entire legal system. One court case in France, which made its way through gossip channels into Victorian drawing rooms, involved a man being ordered by the courts to prove his virility or lose his estate. His wife's family argued that the marriage was fraudulent because he couldn't perform. The solution? A court-supervised demonstration. We're not kidding, and suddenly, your worst honeymoon fears seem mild by comparison. But it wasn't just aristocrats and villagers who engaged in this theatrical obsession with consummation. Even among the respectable middle class, gossip flew faster than wedding rice. Maids would report what they heard or didn't hear through doors. Friends would make bets. Families would watch the couple's mood at breakfast for signs of either embarrassment or triumph. Was she flushed and quiet? Was he smug and relaxed? Were they sitting too far apart? Every gesture, every expression became data. Now pause and breathe. You're back in your own bed. No one's listening. No one's inspecting your sheets. Your postman doesn't report to your mother-in-law. But for Victorians, the pressure to prove, to perform, to be seen doing something utterly private was not just social. It was institutional, because for them, marriage wasn't about love. It was about property. Virginity ensured paternity. Consummation ensured legality. And everything else, desire, intimacy, pleasure, was secondary. And so the act became a performance, not for the lovers themselves, but for everyone else. The cook, the vicar, the in-laws, even the servants who pretended not to care, but definitely had bets going in the pantry. Sometimes the bride faked a stain, using blood from a cut finger, or even from a chicken prepared for dinner. Sometimes the groom drank half a bottle of sherry first. Sometimes, and this is important, nothing happened at all, and the world just pretended it had, because the real game wasn't sex, it was reputation. Tonight, as you drift further into sleep, consider the absurdity of proving love through blood and bed sheets. Imagine your most private moment, monitored by a team of gossiping relatives and emotionally invested staff. Imagine being told your body was evidence, and your marriage a contract that began only when that evidence was delivered, and then let it all go. Because no one is waiting outside your door. No one is folding your sheets with judgment. The door is locked. The lights are low, and your story is your own. You find yourself in a quiet Victorian clinic now. The walls are pale, the curtains stiff. A faint smell of lavender oil, sweat, and denial floats in the air. Somewhere nearby, a ticking clock counts down to something that no one is quite ready to talk about. The doctor is waiting. You're here, of course, because something is wrong. You've been nervous, restless. You can't sleep. You feel things. Tightness in the chest. Racing thoughts. A sudden warmth when your husband touches your arm. Or when he doesn't. Your appetite is strange. Sometimes you cry for no reason. Sometimes you laugh when you shouldn't. You've become unpredictable. And in Victorian terms, that can only mean one thing. You are suffering from hysteria. It's important to pause here and explain something. In the 19th century, hysteria was less a diagnosis and more a catch-all excuse for why women were being, women. Too emotional? Hysteria? Too quiet? hysteria. Too loud, sad, anxious, bored, sweaty, or aroused. Hysteria. The word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, which tells you exactly how scientific this is about to be. According to the prevailing wisdom of the time, the female reproductive system was a kind of rogue organ, wandering around the body, causing mischief. One theory said it floated like a balloon. Another said it emitted vapors. Either way, if you were feeling off, your womb was probably to blame. The cure? Well, this is where it gets complicated and unintentionally hilarious. You're escorted into a small room now. The doctor is serious looking, graying at the temples, and extremely uncomfortable making eye contact. He asks a few vague questions. Do you feel fluttering? Are your thoughts impure? And then announces that he will perform a pelvic massage to calm your nerves. Yes, that's the treatment. A genital massage administered by a trained professional to induce what he will later describe in his notes as a paroxysm of relief. You, of course, aren't told exactly what that means. Victorian women were often so uninformed that they didn't even realize what was happening. They just knew that after 20 minutes of firm, awkward contact, they felt better, lighter, quieter, and the doctor would nod gravely, write something about nervous congestion, and schedule your next appointment. Let's be very clear here. This was not considered sexual, not even a little. It was medicine, clinical, cold, necessary. Doctors genuinely believed they were coaxing the uterus back into proper alignment. They referred to the clitoris as that peculiar nerve cluster. They wore gloves. They hummed hymns under their breath. One physician even claimed he could perform the procedure without looking. And this wasn't some fringe quackery. This was common practice. Hysteria was one of the most frequently diagnosed conditions among middle and upper-class women, and business was booming. So booming, in fact, that doctors started to complain, not about the ethics, of course, but about the hand cramps. That's right. Treating hysteria was exhausting. It required time, stamina, and awkward amounts of eye contact. So naturally, someone invented a machine. Enter the electromechanical vibrator, a new miracle device that could bring women to therapeutic release in under 5 minutes. No personal discomfort required. The earliest models were massive, desk-sized, steam-powered, and terrifying. One version looked like a cross between a sewing machine and an octopus. Later models were more portable, handheld, discreet, battery-operated. They were sold in medical catalogs next to stethoscopes and nasal irrigators. No one blinked. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about efficiency. You flip through a Victorian women's magazine now and find an ad that reads, "For the gentle relief of feminine tension, restores balance, recommended by physicians." There's a delicate illustration of a smiling woman beside a humming machine. The ad does not explain what the machine does, but you get the idea. By the 1890s, vibrators were being marketed for home use. Some doctors sent them home with their patients. Others just handed out instructions. Apply gently until calm is achieved. And still, no one admitted what was actually happening. It's almost admirable, the level of denial at play. A nation of women being regularly brought to orgasm, without anyone acknowledging that's what it was. The fact that this practice went on for decades is a masterclass in collective repression, but also a strange sort of liberation, because for many women, these appointments may have been the only context in which their bodies were ever touched with any real attention. Certainly more gently than the average marriage. certainly more honestly than the rest of their lives. Eventually, hysteria faded as a diagnosis. Freud came along and decided women had daddy issues instead. Machines got quieter. Sex education, real sex education, slowly emerged. But for a brief, bizarre window of time, the medical world created a loophole where women could experience pleasure, as long as they didn't call it that, as long as they didn't know. You step out of the clinic now, the bell above the door jingling softly. Behind you, the doctor wipes his hands, checks his watch, and prepares for his next patient. Another woman, another mystery, another cure. Out on the cobbled street, a steam engine rattles past. A man reads the paper. A girl clutches her shopping basket. And somewhere in a shop window, a new machine hums quietly behind a curtain. Just another tool of the trade, nothing to see here. You find yourself now in the drawing room of a well-appointed Victorian home. The air smells faintly of lavender sachets, beeswax polish, and emotional constipation. There are no sounds except the slow tick of the grandfather clock and the occasional rustle of drapery. Everything is clean, tidy, and just a little too restrained. You're standing in a room so proper, it's practically allergic to excitement. But look closer. That floral wallpaper, it's pulsing with repressed energy. The lace doilies, suffocating symbols of moral purity. And the furniture, covered, quite literally, in shame. Yes, really. Let's talk about table legs. Victorians were famously obsessed with modesty, not just for people, but for objects. It was considered indecent, even risque, for a piano to expose its legs. So households across Britain and America began dressing their furniture. Table legs, chair legs, piano legs, all swaddled in little fabric sleeves to prevent viewers from succumbing to sudden, uncontrollable lust over a curved bit of mahogany. Even the word leg was a bit too spicy. The preferred term was limb, or, if you wanted to be truly delicate, support. So if you ever overheard a Victorian saying, "That table has fine supports," you knew they were really living on the edge. It sounds absurd because it is, but it wasn't just furniture. The same logic extended to everything in the house. A lady's undergarments weren't called underwear. They were unmentionables. Rooms weren't bedrooms. They were chambers. You didn't say breast. You said bosom. Or just pointed vaguely and hoped no one noticed. Language was carefully filtered through layers of gauze and gilt. And when the words weren't enough, the decor took over. Victorian interior design was like emotional repression turned into wallpaper. Floral patterns, everywhere. Heavy drapes over every window. Thick carpets, upholstered everything. Fringes on the lampshades. And a general atmosphere of don't touch that, don't ask, and don't enjoy yourself. It was a world built to contain impulse, to smother desire before it even arrived. If sin couldn't get in the front door, maybe it would just give up and leave. But of course, it didn't. Because underneath all the lace, all the primness, all the precisely ironed respectability, desire still found its way in. It just had to get creative. Take lace, for instance. Supposedly modest, feminine, delicate. But lace was also sheer, suggestive, a whisper of skin beneath. It was the most flirtatious fabric in the Victorian wardrobe, and they loved it. Then there was perfume, not the modern floral variety, but heady musk-laced concoctions designed to leave a trail in the air behind a woman like a scented breadcrumb path. Even letter writing became erotically charged. When public speech was policed and private conversation limited by chaperones, the love letter became the ultimate outlet for longing. Entire relationships bloomed on paper, hidden behind folded pages and sealed with wax. There were coded phrases, carefully scripted passion, and sometimes pressed flowers tucked between the lines. You pick one up now, from the writing desk in the corner. The ink is faded, the handwriting elegant. I remain your devoted admirer, still undone by the brush of your glove and the memory of your sigh. It's almost painfully restrained, but you can feel the heat between the lines. That's the paradox of Victorian life. The more they tried to bury desire, the more powerful it became. Even a glance across a room could throb with tension. Even a piano, with its scandalous legs covered, could feel like a forbidden thrill. There's a theory among some cultural historians that this suffocating modesty wasn't just fear, it was fetish. That for the Victorians, restraint itself became erotic. The act of not saying, not touching, not admitting, made everything more electric. A bare ankle wasn't just a body part, it was a revelation. A gloved hand brushing against yours wasn't casual, it was foreplay. A love letter folded too many times, practically indecent. And so the furniture stayed clothed, the language stayed chaste, but the people burned, silently, daintily, but thoroughly. You step back out of the parlor now, the smell of potpourri clinging to your coat. Behind you the room sits in perfect order, every cushion fluffed, every table modestly draped, every emotion stuffed into a drawer and sealed shut. But now you know the truth. Beneath all that floral upholstery was a culture humming with tension. A world that tried to cover everything, and in doing so, only made it more interesting. You're standing in a Victorian dressing room now, and it's crowded. Not with people, with fabric. So much fabric. Petticoats, stockings, a chemise, maybe bloomers, possibly drawers. Over that, a corset, then more petticoats, a bodice, a crinoline frame, a skirt, another overskirt, a bustle, gloves, jewelry, and finally, for modesty's sake, a cloak. It's less of an outfit and more of an architectural project. The Victorian woman didn't get dressed, she got installed. And all this wasn't just about style, it was about control. Layered fashion acted like armor, a physical expression of virtue. Each added inch of fabric another wall between her and the world, between her and him, between her and herself. It was modesty made tangible and heavy. The average fully dressed woman could weigh 20 to 30 pounds more in clothing alone. She needed help getting in, and sometimes help getting out. Because dressing wasn't just a process, it was a ritual. You step into her shoes now, or rather, her pointed button-up boots. It's morning. The maid is lacing the corset. Your ribs are being coaxed inward, your lungs politely compressed. You're told it helps posture, virtue, and digestion. You believe two of those things. By the time it's fully tightened, you can't take a deep breath. But that's fine. Breathing deeply is vulgar. The corset wasn't merely functional, it was symbolic. A good woman was cinched, contained, controlled. Her waist was a visual shorthand for her morality, and the corset whispered to everyone around her. She is tightly wound. She is properly bound. She is not available. Unless you were the one helping her unlace it. That's where the corset gets interesting, because as much as it restricted, it also seduced. Victorian erotica, yes, there was such a thing, was filled with breathless descriptions of corsets being slowly unlaced, one ribbon at a time. Fictional heroes waxed poetic about undoing 20 tiny buttons in a darkened room. The very thing that symbolized purity also created anticipation, desire hidden beneath restraint. A woman wrapped like a gift no one was allowed to open, except perhaps eventually her husband, or her doctor, or her stable boy. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. And where the corset restrained, the crinoline exaggerated. If the corset made the waist small, the crinoline, that giant bell-shaped cage worn under the skirt, made everything else enormous. At its peak, a fashionable woman might need a 3-foot clearance radius just to enter a room, and that was the point. Crinolines were absurd by design. They created a physical buffer zone, a social distance enforcement tool long before the pandemic. No accidental brushes of the knee, no surprise handshakes. You couldn't even sit properly unless you knew how. It was like wearing a hula hoop made of steel and shame, and it made the simple act of sitting down a slow-motion performance. But again, under all that weight, under all the fuss and flourish, was tension. Because undressing a Victorian woman was like unlocking a puzzle box. You had to know the order, the layers, the logic. You didn't just disrobe her, you revealed her, button by button, tie by tie, which made the act of disrobing both intimate and incredibly drawn out. Foreplay by way of fabric. And since modesty was the performance of the age, the fewer people who ever saw you in your chemise, the more powerful the act became. One glimpse of stocking, one hint of petticoat. Entire poems were written about ankles, and then there was the fainting couch. Every proper Victorian home had one, an elegant piece of furniture placed strategically in the dressing room or parlor, where a lady could recline dramatically when her corset became too much. And it often did become too much. Women fainted. A lot. They were lightheaded from compression, from hunger, from exhaustion. But fainting was also convenient. It allowed you to retreat, to reset, to remain delicate. And perhaps, just perhaps, it allowed a moment of vulnerability, to be seen as fragile, in need of assistance. Sometimes even repression needs a breather. So the clothing lied. It said, I'm virtuous. It said, I'm untouchable. It said, I'm uninterested. But what it really said was this: if you want me, you're going to have to work for it. Victorian fashion was a paradox wrapped in silk and steel. It hid the body and drew attention to it. It claimed modesty and performed seduction. It compressed and invited release. And tonight, as you lie beneath your far more breathable sheets, free of petticoats and whalebone corsets, consider the quiet weight those women carried. They didn't just wear clothes, they wore performance. They wore anxiety. They wore rules stitched into every seam. And still, they found ways to unlace them. You're seated now in the office of a well-dressed Victorian physician. The kind who speaks in Latin, wears too much pomade, and looks perpetually concerned. He has a long wooden desk, a large globe, and an even larger collection of terrible ideas. Today's diagnosis? You're suffering from spermatorrhea. You don't know what it is, but it sounds ominous. And according to this man, it may be the end of your intellectual career, your manhood, and possibly your soul. All because you had an accident in your sleep. Welcome to the scientific panic of the 19th century, a glorious mess of morality, misinformation, and male anxiety dressed up in waistcoats and respectability. This wasn't just about women being repressed. No. Victorian men had their own nightmare. Seed loss. That's right. The loss of semen, outside the sacred context of marriage and baby-making, was believed to weaken the body, dull the mind, and slowly destroy the moral fabric of a man. According to some leading voices of the time, every drop of fluid lost was a drop of vital essence. Waste enough, and you'd become less intelligent, less ambitious, less man. In short, if you didn't stop touching yourself, your brain would shrink, your spine would curve, and you'd wind up in an asylum talking to spiders. It sounds absurd, and it was. But it was also medicine, or at least it claimed to be. Enter the diagnosis of spermatorrhea, a made-up condition that essentially meant involuntary emissions. It could be nocturnal. It could be imagined. But either way, it needed treatment. And the treatments? Leeches, cold baths, electroshock therapy, moral scolding, and, in truly dire cases, surgical intervention, including circumcision or, horrifyingly, castration. Yes. That escalated quickly. You're still sitting in the doctor's office. He pulls out a chart, hand-drawn, of course, showing the stages of mental decline. Stage 1, secret indulgence. Stage 2, memory loss. Stage 3, drooling, muttering madness. All because you were overfond of your own anatomy. And just in case you weren't terrified enough, he mentions phrenology, the pseudoscience of reading skull bumps, as a way of diagnosing moral weakness. Your forehead? Too smooth. Your occipital ridge? Suggests impure thoughts. This is not a joke. Entire prisons and asylums were built on the idea that you could spot degeneracy by the shape of someone's skull. But it wasn't really about science. It was about control. Victorian medicine had a habit of disguising moral panic as biology. If someone behaved outside the norms, sexually, socially, spiritually, there had to be a medical explanation. It couldn't be desire. It had to be disease. And so doctors became the enforcers of purity. They warned schoolboys not to cross their legs. They told parents to remove stimulating literature. They invented special pants, diet regimens, even specialized chairs that made self-touching impossible. One guide from 1865 encouraged parents to check their sons' bed sheets daily and record any suspicious stains in a moral hygiene journal. Imagine your teenage years. With Victorian surveillance, this fear of wasting seed also tied into larger ideas of masculinity, empire, and racial superiority. Vitality wasn't just a personal asset. It was a national one. A weak man made a weak soldier. A weak soldier made a weak empire. And if you couldn't even control yourself in the privacy of your bedroom, how could you possibly be trusted with a voting ballot or a colonial outpost? It was all connected. Moral behavior, national identity, sexual repression. You step away from the physician's office now, past shelves of tonics for purity and elixirs for nerve repair. Outside, the fog curls through the alleyways. A newspaper boy shouts headlines about scandal. Somewhere nearby, a man is quietly panicking about something he did last night, alone, in the dark, and wondering if it means he'll go blind. This wasn't fringe thinking. This was mainstream medicine, and it lasted well into the early 20th century. The real tragedy? The shame stuck around long after the science was debunked. Boys grew into men who feared themselves. Desire became synonymous with danger. Intimacy came with a side of guilt. And the damage lingered, in bodies, in minds, in marriages. So tonight, as you lie there, unmonitored, unlectured, and thankfully leech-free, remember this. The Victorians thought sex could kill your brain, that too much pleasure made you insane, that natural instincts needed cold baths and cage belts. And while we've come a long way, a small part of that fear still echoes in modern silence, awkward health classes, and blushing refusals to name the obvious. But not here. Here, we say it plainly. They were wrong, and their wigs were itchy. Now breathe in. let it go, and prepare to step into something even messier. You find yourself now in a narrow London alleyway just beyond the gas lights, where shadows cling to brick and whispers travel farther than footsteps. It's 1873, and someone, somewhere, is about to become a fallen woman, not because she stole, not because she lied, but because she loved, or didn't say no fast enough, or simply got caught. In Victorian England, virtue wasn't just a moral ideal, it was a currency, and women were expected to guard theirs like a miser hoards gold. You're a woman now, born into this tight-laced century. From the day you could walk in a corset, you've been told that your entire value, your future, your marriage prospects, your place in society, depends on one thing: that you remain pure, not smart, not kind, not capable, just intact. No one ever defines what that means exactly, but everyone acts like they'll know the second you cross the line. You could fall in love, be misled, be violated, or simply be rumored to have done something inappropriate, and that would be enough. Enough to lose your job, enough to lose your home, enough to lose everything. Meanwhile, the man, well, he was expected to have experience. Society turned a blind eye to his indiscretions, encouraged them even. A gentleman might sow his wild oats. It was practically part of the curriculum. There were brothels for that, street corners, ladies of the evening. It was all part of becoming a man. But if a woman even entertained the idea of desire, she was ruined. No second chances, no gray areas. The moral math was simple. His sin was a phase. Hers was a permanent condition. Enter the fallen woman, a character both real and mythologized. She appeared in novels, sermons, public trials. She haunted boarding schools and charity pamphlets. She was the girl who'd made a mistake, and now walked the streets with shame clinging to her hemline. Some were victims of poverty. Some were preyed upon by men in power. Some were simply unmarried mothers. Others were prostitutes, a profession the Victorians tried desperately to pretend didn't exist, even while openly using it. They were all lumped into the same tragic category: women who had lost their virtue and could never get it back. You're walking through a Magdalen laundry now, one of the so-called reform homes for fallen women. The walls are whitewashed, the rules strict, the laundry tubs enormous. Here, women were expected to scrub away their shame with soap and silence. They prayed, they worked, they were rarely seen. Most would never re-enter society with their names intact. It was redemption as punishment. And yet, there were women who pushed back, one in particular, Josephine Butler. You see her now, standing on the steps of Parliament, hair pinned neatly, hands shaking slightly, but eyes absolutely blazing. Butler was a reformer who refused to stay quiet. She exposed the hypocrisy of the Contagious Diseases Acts, which allowed police to forcibly examine suspected prostitutes for venereal disease, often without evidence and always without consent. Men who spread those diseases, rarely punished. Women, shamed, imprisoned, examined like livestock. Josephine called it what it was: legalized assault. She argued, loudly, repeatedly, that morality without justice wasn't morality at all, that punishing poor women while protecting powerful men wasn't order. It was injustice wearing a collar. She rallied crowds, published papers, stormed all male institutions with nothing but a pamphlet and absolute fury. And slowly, she changed things. The acts were eventually repealed, and though the stain of fallenness never fully washed out, cracks appeared in the foundation. But Victorian culture loved a morality tale, especially one with a weeping woman. In novels, fallen women usually died tragically, or went mad, or threw themselves into rivers, a symbolic return to purity. Society was more comfortable with a dead repentant than a living contradiction. Because a fallen woman who survived, who lived without shame, threatened everything. She suggested that virtue wasn't physical, that women might make choices, that desire wasn't exclusive to men, and that was scary. You step back onto the cobbled street now. The city hums around you. A man tips his hat. A woman clutches her shawl tighter. Somewhere nearby, a girl is being told not to speak too loudly, not to sit with her knees apart, not to trust men, but also not to disappoint one. She walks the line between being desirable and being damned, and the line is invisible but brutally enforced. Tonight, as you lie there, not ruined, not labeled, not judged, take a moment to imagine the weight of that invisible ledger, where one kiss could cost your future, where one rumor could erase your name, where virtue was defined entirely by what other people thought you had done. And then remember Josephine Butler, standing alone with her pamphlets and her fury, daring to say, "We are not ruined, we are wronged." And history, at least for a moment, listened. You're walking through London now. The real London, not the one sketched neatly in etiquette manuals or preserved in oil paintings. It's foggy, damp, and a little too alive. Carriages clatter past. The Thames smells like yesterday's sins. Gaslight flickers over crumbling brick. And around every corner, in shadowed alleys and softly lit parlors, is a truth that polite society refuses to admit. Prostitution isn't a shameful secret. It's the city's most reliable institution. At the height of the Victorian era, London had somewhere between 8,000 and 80,000 sex workers, depending on whose report you believed, and how much they wanted to sound shocked. There were brothels on nearly every block, from high-end establishments with velvet wallpaper and imported champagne, to crumbling boarding houses where bed and board often included far more than advertised. There were women in doorways, women at train stations, women who advertised in coded classifieds, offering companionship, cheerful conversation, or the ever-telling phrase, "willing to travel." The city ran on two things: industry and hypocrisy. Men preached purity at the dinner table and wandered into brothels after dark. Clergymen spoke of chastity, then paid extra for discretion. Policemen walked past red-lit windows with the same energy you might scroll past an ad you shouldn't click. No one wanted to talk about it, but no one really wanted it to stop either, because the entire system, marriage, inheritance, status, depended on appearances, and appearances had needs. You slip into one of the more expensive houses now. It's quiet, curtains drawn, perfume hangs in the air like a sigh. The women here are not desperate. They are strategic. Some are kept women, mistresses with regular clients, rooms paid for by powerful men, wardrobes twice the size of their respectable sisters. They attend the opera. They read French novels. They have opinions on lace. And they know exactly how much a man will pay to feel seen, or to be silently ignored. Others are younger, poorer, still learning the rules, still believing maybe that one of these men will marry them. He won't. And for those at the bottom, the system was far less kind. Let's talk about the Contagious Diseases Acts. In the mid-19th century, the British government decided venereal disease, rampant in the military, was a problem that needed solving. But instead of targeting the men spreading it, they blamed the women providing the service. So the state gave police the power to stop any woman suspected of being a prostitute and subject her to a forced internal medical examination. No warrant, no trial, just suspicion. If she was found to be infected, she could be detained for up to 3 months and treated, often with mercury. If she resisted, jail. You're imagining it now. A woman, alone, pulled off the street by an officer who doesn't know her name, doesn't ask her consent, doesn't care about her story. She's 19, maybe 16, maybe younger. She came to the city for work and found herself inspected like spoiled meat. And the man who gave her the disease, he's home in bed, with a wife, and a sermon to deliver in the morning. This wasn't medicine. It was state-sanctioned abuse. And it had almost nothing to do with public health, and everything to do with controlling the bodies of poor women. Because wealthy women were protected by doors, and wealthy men were protected by silence. It was the same sin, but only one side paid the price. Class and morality in the Victorian era weren't separate. They were synonymous. If you had money, your desires were considered eccentric. If you didn't, they were criminal. A man who visited brothels was a man with appetites. A woman who worked in one was a moral failure. If she confessed, repented, and entered a home for fallen women, she might be given a second chance. If she didn't, she was cast out, unnamed, unmourned, but behind the shame and sermons, the truth lingered. This trade was essential. It protected marriages by giving men an outlet. It created jobs for maids, dressmakers, laundresses. It sustained entire neighborhoods, and yet no one spoke of it aloud. Prostitutes were everywhere and completely invisible. You glance through the classifieds now, back pages of newspapers, slips of paper pinned to notice boards, coded ads written in a delicate hand. Refined young lady seeks respectable gentleman for private engagement. Charming widow offers discreet conversation in Kensington. French instruction available, no references required. Everyone knew. Everyone pretended not to. So tonight, as you lie back in comfort, understand this. The Victorian world you've been walking through, the polite one, with covered piano legs and corseted modesty, stood on the shoulders of women it refused to acknowledge. It built virtue with one hand and exploited vice with the other. And the women in those brothels, they were not just side characters. They were infrastructure. The shame wasn't theirs. It belonged to the people who took and judged and then turned away. The room smells faintly of candle wax, ink, and something less definable, longing. A velvet armchair waits beside the fire. There's a book of poems half open on the floor, and a letter folded once too many times, creased along its secret spine. You are now in the private world of Victorian same-sex love, the kind of love that dared not speak its name, but left behind enough clues to fill volumes. On paper, the Victorians were straight, painfully, rigidly, performatively straight. Marriage was mandatory. Sex was presumed to be one-directional, between a man and a woman, preferably once a week, and always with the curtains drawn. And yet, if you stepped behind those curtains, you might find something far more complicated. Let's start with the most famous cautionary tale. Oscar Wilde. Witty, brilliant, undeniably extra. Wilde was the darling of London's literary elite until he became its most scandalous prisoner. In 1895, Wilde was tried and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency, a legal euphemism so vague it could mean almost anything, but usually meant existing while gay. His lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, was young, golden-haired, and very much not a secret. Their relationship was passionate, destructive, and documented in letters so lyrical they practically sighed when opened. But Victorian law didn't care about poetry. Desire between men wasn't just sinful, it was criminal. You might be thinking, if it was illegal, how did anyone get away with it? The answer, they didn't. They just learned how to pretend. They wrote letters laced with plausible deniability. They used coded phrases, dearest friend, intimate companion, bosom bond. They built entire friendships around unspoken truths. And women, they had more room to breathe, at least at first glance. Romantic friendships between women were not only tolerated, they were often celebrated. It was perfectly acceptable, even fashionable, for two women to live together, write love letters, hold hands in public, and be buried side by side. People called it spinster companionship or Boston marriage. No one asked too many questions, because to do so would require acknowledging female desire, and the Victorians very much preferred not to. But not all of these were platonic. Some were deeply romantic, some were sexual, and some existed in the hazy space between emotional survival and forbidden affection. You're reading a letter now, written in slanted script, faded at the edges. I long for the days we spent in the garden, your hand on mine, the sun daring not to interrupt us. It could be friendship, or it could be everything else. That was the point. Ambiguity was protection. Hidden subcultures blossomed where the law refused to look. Private salons in Paris and London, poetry circles that never used the word love, but meant it in every line. Men's clubs where eye contact was a form of rebellion. Ladies' groups where intimacy lived between pages and teacups. There were coded novels, pseudonymous essays, secret dances, and underground journals that circulated like contraband. And while public language preached morality, private correspondence burned with longing. Of course, danger was always present. All it took was one intercepted letter, one betrayed secret, one public accusation, and your life could unravel. Reputation destroyed, home lost, freedom revoked. For Wilde, it was the Old Bailey. For others, it was blackmail, exile, or silent heartbreak. But despite the fear, love still happened. It always does. It slipped between the cracks of respectability. It carved out tiny spaces behind bookshelves and under staircases. It whispered in gardens and held hands in gaslit hallways. Sometimes it was hidden in plain sight, like a shared household with two women, each described as the other's companion. Sometimes it wore uniforms and passed as camaraderie. Sometimes it disguised itself as poetry, and sometimes it didn't bother to hide at all. You sit now by the fireplace, the air warm and quiet. There's a pair of gloves on the table, one slightly smaller than the other, 2 cups of tea, one bed. The house says nothing, but the silence speaks volumes. Tonight, as you lie there, consider the lives lived in shadow, the ones built on euphemism and resilience, the ones that dared to want, even when want was dangerous. Same-sex love in the Victorian era wasn't always tragic. It was often joyful, tender, fierce, but it existed in a world that refused to name it and punished it when it bloomed too boldly. They pretended not to see. And so queer love became an art form. Part choreography, part code, part resistance. And it endured, because love always finds a way, even in corsets and courtrooms. The mail arrives with a soft knock and the scratch of envelopes slipping through the slot. It's wrapped in brown paper, carefully tied, discreetly unlabeled. And beneath that humble wrapping, well, not everyone in this house will be reading the Times tonight. You are now in the world of Victorian erotica, printed in secret, passed hand to hand, and smuggled through the very institution that claimed to defend morality, the Postal Service. Victorian England may have spoken in euphemisms, but it read in detail. Filthy, flowery, surprisingly inventive detail. Let's start with a little gem called The Pearl. Published in the 1870s, The Pearl was a monthly erotic magazine. Think of it as the gentleman's underground Pinterest for scandalous fiction. It featured poetry, short stories, and letters so graphic you could practically hear the petticoats rustling. There were spankings, schoolmistresses, curious stable boys, even historical reenactments with artistic liberties, of course. It was handwritten smut, but bound and delivered with a literary wink, printed anonymously, distributed through hush-hush bookshops, or ordered via post. Subscribers knew to read it behind locked doors, and to never ever sign their real names. Then there was My Secret Life, a massive, anonymous, shockingly detailed memoir written by someone who simply called himself Walter. It spans 11 volumes, thousands of pages, and while no one knows exactly who Walter was, we do know he had an astonishing amount of free time, and apparently very few boundaries. He wrote about his exploits with prostitutes, maids, barmaids, other men's wives, and the occasional footman. He documented it all, breathlessly, graphically, and with a moral compass spinning wildly in every direction. Of course, this wasn't sold at your average bookstall. It was privately printed and distributed in small numbers, circulated among elite collectors like forbidden treasure. To own a copy? Scandalous? To admit you read it? Even worse, to say you enjoyed it? Well, welcome to the watch list. But erotica wasn't the only thing sliding through Victorian mailboxes. There were marital guides, books pretending to be educational, but slipping into steamy territory somewhere after Chapter 2. One popular title, The Wedding Night, warned husbands not to frighten their brides, then proceeded to offer rather specific advice on how not to. Another, Hints for Husbands, included tips like, be gentle, go slowly, and don't expect too much. Also, don't discuss the act the next morning. Helpful. For the more visually inclined, there was mail-order lingerie. While respectable women were expected to wear layers of cotton and lace that screamed, "Don't look at me," some shops offered slightly more daring options, if you knew where to look. Catalogs, distributed very quietly, advertised French drawers, Parisian bodices, and romantic novelties. Some shops even sold aphrodisiacs, tonics, herbs, oils, promising improved vigor, restored feminine appetite, or, and this is real, cheerful womb circulation. And if you were particularly bold, you could even order photographs. Sepia-toned portraits of models in various states of disarray. Sometimes nude, sometimes mid-undressing, sometimes just staring at the camera like they know your deepest shame. You pick up one of these letters now. The ink is faded, the seal broken. Inside there's a pressed violet, and words like, "My dear heart, how I long for the brush of your hand in mine, for the closeness denied to us in daylight." It's tender, it's coded, it's barely scandalous, unless you know what to look for. Victorian love letters walked a tightrope. They couldn't say too much, not directly. But they said everything between the lines. Sometimes it was a flower, sometimes a faint scent, sometimes an initial, sometimes just the paper itself, chosen carefully, perfumed slightly, folded with reverence. If you knew the code, you could read volumes in 3 sentences. And then there was the postman. Oh yes, the postman always knew. He delivered perfume-stained letters with no return address, packages wrapped in silk, envelopes that rattled or weighed oddly for their size. He whistled past doors where he'd already seen too much. He learned not to ask questions. In many ways, he was the quiet enabler of every scandal in town, the keeper of secrets tied up with string and wax. All of this, the letters, the novels, the lingerie, the coded poems, was a rebellion against silence. Because the Victorians wanted, desperately, they just couldn't admit it in public, so they wrote it, posted it, read it under the covers with trembling fingers, and pretended by morning that it had never happened. Tonight, as you lie in bed with your own privacy intact, no scandalous package on the nightstand, no trembling envelope tucked under your pillow, remember this. The Victorians mailed their secrets, wrapped them in metaphors, pressed them into flowers, whispered them through ink and string. They were told not to desire, so they documented desire instead, in stories, in silk, in size sealed with wax, and somewhere in that chaos of shame and imagination, they made intimacy artful. You open the morning paper. Page 1 is war. Page 2 is Parliament. And on page 3, squeezed between shipping schedules and an ad for hair tonic, is a scandal involving a baroness, a stable boy, and a suspiciously creaky staircase. Welcome to Victorian England, where the streets were foggy, the morals were clear, and lust was supposed to stay politely out of sight. But of course, it didn't. For a society obsessed with propriety, adultery was everywhere. And when it happened, or was even rumored to have happened, it didn't stay private for long. It made headlines. It filled courtrooms. It spilled into the drawing rooms and teacups of every person with a pulse and an opinion. You're sitting in a packed courtroom now. The air smells like perfume, ink, and sweat, mostly from the journalists scrambling to write down every salacious word. A man, red-faced and trembling, is accusing his wife of unthinkable betrayal. Or perhaps it's the other way around. Victorian divorce trials were often public theater. Because yes, divorce did exist, but it wasn't easy or equal. A man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A woman, she had to prove adultery and cruelty, or and abandonment, or and incest, or and some other elaborate bonus sin. Adultery alone didn't count, not for women. Why? Because to the Victorian mind, a man straying was unfortunate, but a woman straying was unnatural. So when an affair came to light, the blame was already pre-assigned. Even if he was the one who left, even if he had a mistress in every county, even if he moved into her sister's house with a houseplant named Desire. If the woman stepped out, even emotionally, she became the villain. She was mocked, shamed, disowned, sometimes institutionalized, sometimes dragged through years of litigation, only to end up penniless and erased. Because in Victorian logic, if a woman lost her virtue, she had no value left. And if she dared to enjoy that loss, that was a moral collapse of epic proportions. And yet, the public couldn't look away. Newspapers published court transcripts. Pamphlets circulated with steamy courtroom sketches. People brought opera glasses to trials just to get a better look at the accused. They judged harshly, but they also indulged, because adultery was titillating. It let people watch from the sidelines, cluck their tongues, and quietly enjoy the forbidden. Let's talk about the psychology of it. You tell an entire population that sex is shameful, that pleasure is suspect, That desire must be locked away in corsets and prayer books. And what happens? They think about sex constantly. They dream it. They whisper it. They read it in poems and see it in the way someone tilts a teacup. They invent fantasies because they're not allowed to acknowledge real ones. It's the oldest trick in the book. Repress something hard enough, and it becomes erotic by default. That's why a glimpse of ankle could undo a man. Why a love letter hidden in a book became a religious experience. Why an affair, once uncovered, could electrify an entire country. Grumpy aside, tell people not to think about sex, and they will absolutely dream about nothing else. But there's a darker side too. Because shame doesn't just fester quietly, it lashes out. It created a world where women were punished for being desirable, and even more punished for desiring. Where men were excused, as long as they lied well enough. Where the line between morality and cruelty was often blurred, so long as the outcome looked respectable. Imagine being a Victorian woman. You marry young. You fulfill your duties. You do everything right. But your husband is cold, or absent, or unfaithful. And you, in a moment of vulnerability or defiance, fall for someone else. A kind neighbor, a charming boarder, a man who looks at you like you still exist. You risk everything for one brief moment of closeness, and then the fallout comes, and it only lands on you. Institutional blame was built into the system. Doctors would diagnose women with hysteria. Again, priests would speak of redemption if she repented hard enough. Families would whisper her name like a curse. And the law rarely cared why she strayed, only that she had. Even when adultery was the symptom, the system treated it like the disease. And yet, under all that judgment, people still kept breaking the rules. They couldn't help it. They were human. Victorian lovers snuck out windows. They met in carriages. They used servants to deliver letters and bribed maids to look the other way. They hid under layers of social fabric, but they didn't stop wanting. And that's the contradiction at the heart of it all. A culture that preached punishment but secretly craved pleasure. A society that feared desire and fed off it. You lie back now, eyes closed, imagining those dim-lit bedrooms and echoing courtrooms. The rustle of silk, the slam of a judge's gavel, the sound of someone trying very hard to pretend they're not enjoying being ruined. You don't have to agree with the Victorians, but you do have to admire their talent for denial. They managed to turn repression into theater, shame into a public sport, and desire into scandal, art, and disaster, sometimes all at once. And somehow, in all that twisted mess, they revealed the one truth they couldn't admit. You can't punish people out of wanting. You can shame them. You can cage them. You can even legislate their fantasies. But in the quiet dark, they will always want. The fire's burned low now. The corset lies on the floor, finally unstrung. And the last scandalous letter has been folded and tucked away. You've made it through 4 hours of gaslight and guilt, lace and longing, moral sermons and velvet shadows. Through all the repression, all the euphemisms, all the unspoken rules carved into wood, stitched into clothing, and whispered across pews. And yet, despite everything, despite the sermons, the sheet inspections, the piano legs in little trousers, the Victorians still loved, still longed, still touched, still wrote, still dreamed, still blushed at the curve of an ankle or the brush of a gloved hand. They still imagined. Because that's the truth, isn't it? You can lace a society into silence. You can cover up the furniture, hush the instincts, burn the books. But you can't stop people from wanting. Not really. And that quiet defiance, the hidden glances, the coded poems, the forbidden thoughts pressed between petals, that's where the real story lives. Not in the law books, not in the court transcripts, but in the spaces in between. So now, let your eyes fall closed. You are far from the parlor room gossip and the moral panic of 1843, far from the parson's glare and the doctor's unsolicited diagnosis of hysteria. There's no vicar listening at your door, no aunt inspecting your linens, just the soft hush of rain outside the window, the echo of distant church bells, and the slow, steady crackle of a fireplace that asks nothing of you. Tonight, you may sleep unjudged, uncorseted, unbothered by the rules of a century that tried very hard not to touch itself and failed spectacularly. Thank you for joining this long, ridiculous, fascinating journey. Subscribe if you haven't already. And let me know quietly, of course, what century you're watching from. But for now, sleep well. The Victorians are finally quiet, and so are you.